on a raw November evening, when London wore its mantle of damp fog and the lamps along Baker Street glowed like sullen embers in a grate, Dr. Watson sat close to the fire and turned a recently purchased medical journal unread in his hands. The coals hissed, the smoke from Holmes's pipe hung in blue ribbons above the mantel-shelf, and somewhere in the street a costermonger's weary cry dwindled into silence. It was upon such nights that chance or providence had a habit of tapping at the door of 291B, as if the city, puzzled by its own mysteries, had resolved to lay them at Holmes's slippered feet. Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread in the passage was followed by a brisk rap, and the entrance of a maid in the dark livery of a great house, her cloak dotted with the thawing pearls of mist. She carried, with a kind of careful dread, a small glass cloche beneath which a crimson rose lay upon its own cut stem. The bloom was full and flawless, no bruise on the petals, no paling at the edges, no bowing of the head toward decline. It had the insolent freshness of a flower newly plucked from a June bower, and yet November scratched at the panes, and London's gardens slept in their winter beds. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes from Lady Ashbury," the maid announced, her voice trembling with the importance of her errand. "She begs you, sir, to regard it at once." Holmes, who had been lounging with a languid air upon the sofa, rose with that swift economy of movement which betrayed the spring coiled under his indolence. He inclined his head to the girl, lifted the cloche by its glass knob, and bent until the rose was within a hand's breadth of his keen grey eyes. He did not touch it. His nostrils flared. The pipe found the shelf without his looking, and the thin, eager face sharpened as if a draught had passed over it. "Pray be seated, my good girl," Watson said, drawing forward a chair, though she remained hovering at the threshold. "There is a note," the maid added, producing an envelope whose creamy surface bore the blue crest of Ashbury House. Holmes slit it with his long nail and scanned the contents. Then he read it aloud, his voice even. "Mr. Holmes, I am beset by a phenomenon to which I cannot ascribe any natural cause. I send under separate cover the rose which has not faded since the morning of my husband's death, now 8 days past. Pray, if your engagements permit, favour me with your presence this night. I am most urgently compelled, for the bloom does not wilt, while the peace of our house declines with every hour. Yours in distress, Aurelia, Lady Ashbury." Watson felt the little stirring he had learned to recognize, the anticipation that comes when a case, by some deft stroke of fate, places its singularity upon the hearth-rug. He looked from the letter to the flower, which shone as though a secret sun suffused it from within. 8 days, Holmes murmured. "Remarkable." The maid swallowed. "Her ladyship said, begging pardon, that the rose was cut by his lordship's own hand on the morning of," she faltered. "We have kept it covered, sir, as instructed. The gardener says it is not natural. Mrs. Albury, the housekeeper, says it is wicked. The footmen have taken to crossing themselves when they pass the morning-room." "Ah," Holmes said softly, and there was neither mockery nor belief in the sound, only the interest of a mind presented with a knot. "Lady Ashbury writes that her peace declines. Why?" The maid's fingers tightened upon the edges of her cloak. "There are callers," she said, lowering her voice. "Strange gentlemen who asked to see her ladyship in private, and a foreign personage who came after sunset and would not be refused, though Mr. Rook, the butler, stood in his way. Her ladyship has taken to her rooms. And then there is Lord Ashbury." "Who is quite beyond earthly callers," Holmes interposed, his gaze still upon the rose. "Yet you would speak of him." "They say he walks," she whispered, and the fire popped as if in rebuke. Not the maids always talk, but the housekeeper herself heard steps on the gallery 2 nights after the funeral, and a door shut that none of us can open. Watson rose, for the fog seemed suddenly chill in the room. He was not a man given to superstition, but the image of a flower refusing decay beside a household in terror did not sit comfortably with his common sense. Holmes, whose contempt for the spectral was absolute, only nodded, and in the nod Watson detected his acceptance of the case. "You came straight from Ashbury House?" Holmes asked. "You did not tarry to exhibit this botanical marvel to a chemist in Wigmore Street, nor to a reporter in Fleet Street, nor, heaven forfend, to a vendor in the Burlington Arcade?" "No, sir," she said, startled. "I came by cab as fast as the horse would go, paid for by her ladyship herself, and I am to take back your answer." "Which is," Holmes said, reaching for his violin case as one might reach for a hat, "that we will wait upon Lady Ashbury within the hour." He set the rose back beneath its glass and fixed the cloche in place with a thoughtful care. "There is much to unlearn in this matter. Watson, your coat." Watson was already shrugging into his ulster. "Do you make anything of it, Holmes?" he asked, for he had seen the sudden focusing of his friend's expression, the alertness that foreruns a deduction as lightning foreruns thunder. "I make at the moment a bouquet of possibilities," Holmes returned. "The air of the thing is theatrical, but you have seen a stage before, Watson. Behind it there are ropes and pulleys. Let us discover where the fly-loft has been concealed." The maid exhaled as if she had been holding her breath since she entered. "Bless you, sir," she said fervently. "I shall tell her ladyship to expect you." "Tell her," Holmes said, "to place this rose where it has spent the last 8 days, and tell her to have no one stand sentry over it but the housekeeper, if she trusts her. As for the foreign personage, his card, if he left one, will be of interest. Go now, and take care not to tilt the glass." When she had gone and the door closed, Watson moved nearer the cloche. "It is fresh," he said, "as fresh as if the gardener had cut it under an hour ago. There is no iodic smell, no obvious anointing, yet no bloom, however hardy, can cheat the laws of nature thus." "Natures are often cheated by artifices," Holmes replied, his lids drooping as he entered that mental chamber, where, I have no doubt, the most astonishing apparatus stood ready for the rapid assembly of ideas. "You remark the absence of scent? Interesting. The calyx is intact. The receptacle shows no scoring. The stem, while cut at a slant, has not been cauterized. The glass is ordinary. You will oblige me, Watson, by observing that the petals bear no dew. If anything has been done, it is of a sort that leaves little to read upon the surface." "And the note?" Watson prompted. "Desperation, not hysteria," Holmes said. "Aurelia, an Italian at name, married into an old English house. The crest speaks of a long descent, a husband dead 8 days, a flower that denies decay, nocturnal visitors, servants who hear steps where none should be. If one wished to unseat a rational woman, one could not contrive better preliminaries." He turned, and his eyes were bright. "Come, my dear fellow. A cab." They descended into the muffled street where the lamps floated like orange moons in the fog. The jarvey clucked to his horse, the wheels went softly over the wet cobbles, and Baker Street slid away behind them like a closed chapter. As the hansom threaded the dim arteries of Marylebone and swung southward, Watson watched Holmes's profile, ascetic, intent, the aquiline nose cutting the vapour like a knife. Now and then Holmes tapped the corner of the seat with his long fingers in a silent code of thought. When at last he spoke, it was almost to himself. "A rose that will not wilt, Watson, is as unnatural as a clock that will not run down. Both promise eternity, and both must be wound by a human hand." Watson, who had seen too many improbable truths to scoff, only said, "You suspect trickery." "I suspect purpose," Holmes returned. "Trickery is a means. The question is, toward what end?" The cab drew up before Ashbury House, whose facade loomed out of the fog like a cliff. A lamp burned over the portico. A footman, square and solemn, opened at the first pull. As they crossed the threshold, the hush peculiar to great houses in distress fell over them, a hush in which carpets drink the sound of steps and the walls seem to listen. Somewhere a clock ticked. Farther off, a door whispered shut upon its hinges. "Mr. Holmes," said the butler, a man whose iron-grey hair might have been parted with a set square. "Her ladyship awaits you in the morning-room." Holmes gave Watson a look that contained both caution and appetite. "The stage, my dear doctor," he murmured. "Let us see how they have set it." The morning-room wore the careful quiet that attends grief in great houses, a low fire, lamps shaded, curtains drawn against the fog. On a polished table by the south window stood the glass cloche, the crimson rose unblighted beneath. Lady Ashbury rose when they entered, young still, dark and fine. Fatigue had etched itself about her eyes, yet her manner was composed. "My lady," said Holmes with a grave inclination, "you honour us. We came at once, without delay." "If reason can be salvaged," she returned, "it will be by you, Mr. Holmes. My house is no longer itself. It began with my husband's death. It has continued with that flower which refuses to fade, and strangers have come who speak as if they hold a claim upon me." Holmes's glance travelled. Bell pull, hearth, window catches, the slight disorder that betrays new habits. "You have sat long in this chair," he said. "The carpet curls where your foot rests, the bell cord is polished, and the tray is set within easy reach. You have watched this door." "I have scarcely slept," she admitted. "By day the servants whisper. At night there are footsteps." Holmes studied the bloom without lifting the glass. "Particulars. Lord Ashbury cut this himself." "From the east, parterre at 7:30 on Tuesday," she said. "He placed it beneath the cover and went to his study. He fell before luncheon." The physician wrote, "Heart failure." "The study lies where?" "Across the gallery beyond the stair, next to the muniment room." "And since then the rose has remained covered?" "By my order. On the second night steps crossed the gallery at 2 o'clock and a door shut." "Who heard them?" "Mrs. Albury, my housekeeper. She sleeps in the little room beyond this. In the morning the muniment door was locked, and none of our keys would turn it." Holmes examined bell-rope, skirting and latches, the faint bloom of dust where a cloth had lately passed. "You spoke of callers." "There have been 3, she said. Mr. Peaver, the family solicitor, who went away troubled. Then a shabby person who refused his name and asked whether I had found what was promised. I had him shown out. Last evening came a foreign gentleman, Italian, I think, Dr. Lazzaro Bardi. He begged a private audience on a botanical matter of delicacy and said he would return." Mr. Rook, the butler, permitted his brow to darken. Holmes saw it. "You disapprove, Mr. Rook?" "I do not like his eye, sir," Rook replied. "I have kept the house close." "Good," said Holmes. "I shall wish to see Mrs. Albury, the muniment door, and the east parterre. We will begin outside while the light holds, this night." They crossed a flagged passage and came to the courtyard where fog lay. The east parterre showed its winter geometry, squared beds and a sheltered wall with late blooms. Holmes stood motionless, then dropped upon one knee beneath the library windows. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "Light footmarks imprinted in frost and blurred by thaw, a scrape upon the paving where a heel turned, and here He touched a blade, preserved under the eave, a faint smear as of wax or oil. "Hales the gardener?" Rook shook his head. "Hales is a heavy fellow, those are not his." Holmes's gaze rose to the sill. "A ladder stood here within the last 3 days. There are the arcs where it abraded the paint. This window has been opened from without." Lady Ashbury caught her breath. "Let nothing be altered," Holmes said. "If we startle our visitor, he will grow cautious. Now the rose bed. One bush is years younger than its neighbours, yet bears a bloom equal to the finest, a recent graft." "Is that material?" asked Watson. "It will become so," Holmes said. "Everything living confesses if one listens. We shall examine the library and the gallery." They re-entered by a side door. The gallery ran like a narrow bridge above the hall. Holmes knelt to the carpet. "There," he said, "crushed nap at regular intervals, slow, measured pacing at hours when servants sleep." They came to a stout oaken door banded with iron. Lady Ashbury produced a ring of keys. None would turn. Holmes set ear and fingertip to the panel. "No breath of air," he said. "Either the wards are altered, or a bar set within." "Rook, when was this door last certainly open?" "On the day before my lord's death," said the butler. "I took him there myself to fetch a deed." "And since then no locksmith?" "None, sir." Holmes regarded the lock. "We will not force it. There is a simpler route for one who knows old houses. Watson, you perceive the service stair? Excellent. We will map the passages and then return to the morning room. I have an experiment to make with that cloche." Lady Ashbury's composure wavered. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "am I mad to see a meaning in the flower?" "You are rational to see design where nature is overruled," he replied. "Whether that design is benevolent or wicked is what we are here to learn." Holmes bent over the cloche once more, his long fingers poised above the glass, as though the act of touching it might disturb a delicate equilibrium. The fire threw a steady light across the table, gleaming off the rose's silken surface. For a moment he said nothing, and the ticking of a clock on the mantel became loud in the stillness. Then with a soft exhalation he lifted the cover, held it by its rim, and observed the air that escaped from beneath. He replaced it swiftly, his eyes narrowing. "There is a faint odour barely perceptible," he murmured. "Not the natural scent of the flower, Watson. More akin to spirits or some volatile agent, though exceedingly subtle. The absence of decay may be chemical rather than mystical." Lady Ashbury watched him intently. "Then it is an experiment, not a miracle?" "Possibly both," Holmes replied. "But I would not yet assign its authorship to your late husband or to nature. Both may be but instruments." He straightened, and his gaze travelled again to the locked door at the far end of the corridor. "If there is deception, it was planted there where none has entered since his death." Holmes requested a taper, and with a calm precision that made Watson's nerves tighten, he passed the flame near the air beneath the glass. Nothing flared, but a minute film of condensation formed along the rim, clear proof, he explained, of recent temperature variation. "A volatile essence has been sealed with it," he said. "Its properties might retard decay. Yet one question persists. Why would Lord Ashbury, a man of position and sense, perform such an act on the morning of his death?" Lady Ashbury's voice trembled. "He had become withdrawn, Mr. Holmes. Since midsummer he spoke of a discovery he had made, something to preserve life against corruption, as he phrased it. I thought him overtired. His letters grew secretive. He received foreign correspondence bearing seals I did not know." "Foreign," Holmes repeated quietly. "Was one of those correspondents perhaps the man Bardi?" She started. "Yes, I have seen the name on an envelope once. I remember it because of its curious crimson ink." Holmes's expression sharpened, but he said only, "May I see your husband's study?" The butler led the way to the great staircase. The air grew colder as they ascended, the faint draughts of an old house whispering through unseen cracks. The study lay behind heavy doors, whose brass plate still bore Lord Ashbury's name. Within, the room smelt of leather, smoke, and the faint metallic tang of chemicals. The fire grate was filled with fine white ash, as if papers had lately been burned. Holmes paused at once before the hearth and sifted the remains with the tip of a letter opener. "Fragments of vellum," he said. "Not ordinary paper, something more enduring. These black edges indicate sealing wax dripped upon parchment. A document destroyed in haste, perhaps on the morning of his death." Watson turned over a scorched scrap. "There are the letters Rosa and something ending in Vita." Holmes inclined his head. "Latin, I suspect, Rosa Vitae, the rose of life. We may be dealing not merely with botany, but with the alchemy of legend. It is a phrase one encounters in certain esoteric tracts concerning the prolongation of vitality. Your husband, madam, was dabbling in old dreams." Lady Ashbury clasped her hands. "He was a rational man, Mr. Holmes, until he met Dr. Bardi in London last spring. From that time he kept vials, powders, and sealed boxes under lock. He spoke little of his work, yet I could see it consumed him. The night before his death he said, 'Aurelia, if I succeed, death will be a postponement only.' Those were his last words to me." Holmes's grey eyes gleamed with that light Watson had seen in him only when the game was truly afoot. He began to move swiftly through the study, examining drawers, instruments, and the marble-topped table where a retort still stood, its tube discoloured by some recent reaction. "He heated this apparatus within hours of his collapse," he said. "Observe the residue, yellowish and crystalline. It may have produced the very vapour now within your glass dome." From his pocket he drew a small lens and studied the residue. Sulphate of quinine mingled with some aromatic oil, rose perhaps, or myrrh. Ingenious, though not unknown to certain continental chemists. I shall require a sample for analysis. He took a tiny scraping with his penknife and placed it into a folded paper. Then his attention fell upon the writing desk, where an inkwell of dark blue glass stood uncapped. Holmes bent close and gave a short, low whistle. "Watson, bring the candle here. Note how the ink has coagulated. The pen was dropped before it could be replaced. There are 3 blots, forming a pattern, an interrupted signature perhaps? Yes. Or the rest smudged by a fall. He may have been addressing his wife in his final instant." Watson's eyes moved toward Lady Ashbury, but Holmes was already scanning the floor beneath the desk. A small metallic disc caught the light. He picked it up with a handkerchief and turned it over. "A coin," he murmured. "No, an Italian lira, marked with the year 1897. Our foreign visitor leaves his scent wherever he passes." Rook, the butler, frowned. "That must have fallen from Dr. Bardi's pocket when he came, sir. He insisted upon entering this very room, though my lady forbade it. Said it was vital to the preservation of the specimen." Holmes's gaze lifted. "The specimen?" He referred to the rose. "So he did, sir. Then his claim extends beyond curiosity. He believes it his, by right of knowledge or invention." Holmes placed the coin carefully upon the desk. "We have crossed the threshold from mystery into contest. One man dead, one woman frightened, one foreign doctor who speaks of preservation and carries coins not yet current in this country. A pattern emerges." Watson asked, "You think the flower was part of their experiment?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, that the flower was the result and the key. Lord Ashbury's discovery may have preserved one thing at the expense of another. He found how to keep beauty from decay, but death claimed him instead. If so, Dr. Bardi may covet both the formula and its proof. Lady Ashbury shivered. Then my husband's death, was it natural? Holmes looked at her with quiet gravity. There is no such thing as natural death, madam. When human ambition tampers with nature, we shall know more when we have entered the locked room. The butler bowed. Shall I fetch the locksmith, sir? Holmes smiled faintly. No, Mr. Rook. The man who locked that door left us his own key. Watson, see the groove beside the lintel? The dust is disturbed, the hinge pins freshly oiled. The lock was not jammed. It was meant to resist the wrong hands. With a thin blade here, so, and a turn, the tumblers yielded with a click. The door swung inward on silent hinges. A draught of cold, dry air met them, carrying a faint odour of metal and roses. Holmes stepped across the threshold, the candlelight wavering on shelves of bottles, dried herbs, and a great cabinet at the far wall covered with a black cloth. Watson, he said softly, bring the light nearer. We are about to see whether the dead can indeed refuse corruption, or whether the living have compelled it. The air of the locked chamber was lifeless, the stillness of years compressed into days. A faint tang of chemicals pricked the nostrils, and the gleam of glassware lined the shelves like soldiers under dust. Holmes held the candle high, its light trembling over stoppered bottles marked with alchemical symbols, notebooks stacked in meticulous disorder, and instruments that suggested both the chemist's bench and the conjurer's table. The black cloth covering the large cabinet stirred faintly as if touched by an unseen breath. Holmes's gaze fixed upon it, and in 2 strides he was beside it, drawing the cloth aside with one swift movement. Watson started. Within the cabinet, behind a pane of crystal glass, lay another rose, identical to the first, save that this one was withered to a brittle skeleton, its petals fallen to dust. Around it were notes in a fine, slanting hand, each marked Experiment I, Experiment II, and so forth. The handwriting, though elegant, grew erratic toward the end, as if the writer's hand had trembled. Holmes scanned a few pages by the candlelight, his eyes darting from line to line. "Listen to this," he said. "Formula achieved, vital essence preserved, duration indefinite, subject structure unaltered, application to organic life pending." He looked up sharply. "We are standing in the theatre of an obsession, Watson. Lord Ashbury was not content with mere preservation of beauty. He aimed at life itself." Lady Ashbury's voice broke the silence, soft but edged with fear. "Life itself? You mean immortality?" Holmes did not answer at once. "Call it what you will," he said finally. "There are always men who, not content to live wisely, must live forever, yet they seldom calculate the price." He picked up a sealed vial from the shelf, held it to the light, and shook it gently. A faint shimmer of golden liquid moved within. The essence of rose oil, modified with quinine and some unknown element. If I mistake not, this is the agent that produced the effect you have witnessed. Watson, whose medical training stirred uneasily, bent nearer. "And if inhaled or ingested?" "Potentially fatal," Holmes said gravely. "Lord Ashbury may have tested it upon himself. A man so driven could easily cross the border between experiment and madness." As they spoke, a floorboard creaked behind them. Rook turned sharply toward the door, his hand half raised in alarm. But the corridor beyond was empty, the candlelight falling across the threshold. Holmes's expression grew tense, his senses alert. "We are not alone in this part of the house," he murmured. "Someone listens or lurks." He moved noiselessly to the doorway and beckoned Watson to extinguish the candle. In the dimness that followed, faint light leaked beneath the door opposite. A shadow passed there, swift, purposeful, gone again. Holmes opened the door without a sound and stepped into the passage. A draught carried a whiff of something, spice, tobacco, and a sharper, medicinal odour. The faint echo of a footstep drifted down the stairwell and was swallowed by silence. When they returned to the laboratory, Lady Ashbury stood very still, her face pale in the flickering light. "You think that man, Dr. Bardi, has entered my house again?" she whispered. Holmes replaced the vial carefully. "I think, madam, that your husband's work has drawn interest beyond the grave. Bardi seeks what Lord Ashbury discovered, and he will not cease until he holds it. For the moment, we must secure every object in this room." Rook fetched a key, but Holmes stayed his hand. "No, not yet. Locking this chamber would serve little purpose if the intruder already possesses a duplicate key, or better yet, a hidden passage. I shall examine the walls." With the thorough patience of his craft, Holmes tapped along the panels, listening for a hollow echo. Behind the cabinet came a dull, different sound. He pressed firmly. A section of wood moved, revealing a narrow recess, scarcely wide enough for a man. A breath of damp air escaped, smelling faintly of earth. "There we have it," he said in satisfaction. "A private access to the servants' stair, long forgotten but recently used. See the scuff on the threshold. Someone entered this way while we were below." Watson knelt and touched the edge. The dust was freshly disturbed. "The intruder may still be near." "Precisely," Holmes said, "but the night is his ally, and I have no wish to alarm the household. We shall let him believe he remains unseen. When the fox imagines himself unobserved, he returns to the coop." Lady Ashbury pressed a trembling hand to her throat. "You mean to lay a trap?" "I mean to allow him the opportunity to spring his own," Holmes replied. "For the moment, madam, this room will remain undisturbed. We shall have it sealed quietly tomorrow, under my supervision. Tonight you will sleep, with your maid in the chamber adjoining this one, with the door bolted from within. Mr. Rook will post himself at the foot of the stair. Watson and I shall remain below." They descended again to the morning room, where the first rose still glowed under the glass. Holmes regarded it in silence, then drew from his pocket a small strip of litmus paper, which he inserted briefly beneath the cloche. When he withdrew it, the paper bore a faint, violet stain. "As I thought," he said softly. "The air here is charged with a trace of chemical vapour, one capable of halting organic decay. Whoever prepared this knew precisely what he was doing." Watson, studying the glass, said, "It resembles the work of those continental physiologists experimenting with suspended animation." "Just so," Holmes agreed, "but none has yet claimed success until now." He turned toward the window where the fog pressed like a living thing against the panes. "I shall require the assistance of Inspector Lestrade by dawn. Scotland Yard's presence may discourage our nocturnal visitor from further liberties." Lady Ashbury clasped her hands together. "Mr. Holmes, if this man, if Bardi, should attempt to take the rose, what then?" Holmes looked at her, the lines of his face as fine and hard as cut steel. "Then, madam, we must allow him to believe that he has succeeded. Deception, after all, is not the privilege of criminals alone." It was past midnight when the household retired. Holmes and Watson took their vigil in the library, a single lamp burning low. The rain had begun again, whispering against the windows. Holmes sat motionless in the armchair, his eyes half closed, every faculty alive beneath that deceptive calm. "Watson," he said at length, "observe the beauty of the plan. The experiment demanded concealment, the death supplied it. and the legend of a rose that will not fade cloaks the truth in marvel. But the marvel will prove mortal before morning. Watson leaned forward. You expect an attempt tonight? I rely upon it, Holmes murmured. And when our visitor comes, he shall find that the dead are not the only ones who watch in silence. The long night settled heavily over Ashbury House, its walls groaning faintly as the wind threaded through the chimneys. The hour was near 2 when Holmes stirred in his chair, his keen senses attuned to the house's smallest tremor. Watson had begun to doze, his head nodding over the armrest, when Holmes's hand touched his sleeve with silent urgency. Listen, he whispered. Watson held his breath. Somewhere above, a faint metallic click rang out, followed by the slow, deliberate creak of a door on its hinges. The sound drifted through the stillness, so faint it might have been imagination, yet Holmes's eyes had already sharpened into steel. The gallery, he murmured. Our nocturnal friend is punctual. They rose soundlessly. Holmes motioned for the lamp to be extinguished, and they stood in near darkness, only the glow of the dying hearth painting faint outlines of their figures. The faintest reflection caught Holmes's face, a glint of thought, not fear. He will pass the stair to reach the morning room, he said under his breath. We shall intercept him from the west corridor. Keep low, Watson. They moved with quiet precision, their footfalls muffled by the thick carpets. The great hall loomed below, pale shapes of statuary rising like ghosts. A narrow slit of light flickered at the far end of the corridor, the beam of a lantern half concealed under a coat. Holmes advanced until they were within 20 paces, then halted behind a tall marble pedestal. Through the gap, Watson saw a man kneeling by the morning room door. His shoulders were narrow, his coat dark and foreign cut. He worked swiftly at the lock with a tool of thin steel, utterly absorbed in his task. Holmes's whisper was a breath at Watson's ear. Do not speak, observe. The door yielded with a faint snap. The man entered, closing it softly behind him. Holmes stepped forward like a shadow gliding across the wall. In 2 silent strides, he was at the threshold, listening. A minute passed, then another. Suddenly a muffled exclamation came from within, the sound of glass striking the floor. Holmes flung open the door. The intruder stood frozen beside the table, the glass cloche shattered, the immortal rose in his gloved hand. His lantern cast a trembling circle of light that fell upon a thin, hawk-faced man with hollow eyes and a black moustache, the unmistakable visage of an Italian. Dr. Lazzaro Bardi, I presume? Holmes said, his tone cool and courteous. Bardi started, his expression a blend of fear and defiance. You should not interfere, Mr. Holmes. The lady does not comprehend the value of what she guards. I comprehend enough, Holmes replied, stepping closer. Put down that rose. It has been dead since the day it was cut. Only your chemicals grant it the illusion of life. The Italian's mouth twisted. You call illusion what you cannot achieve. Your England still buries men while we seek to preserve them. Lord Ashbury understood. He was close, so close, to triumph. Triumph? Holmes echoed. If you call a man's death at his own table triumph, then yes, he succeeded admirably. Bardi's eyes flashed. He died because he betrayed the experiment. He sought to hide the formula from me. It was mine by right. We were partners. Holmes advanced another step, his tone edged with quiet authority. Partners in what? Fraud? Murder? In science, Bardi hissed. He believed the essence could hold vitality itself, the very breath of existence within a suspended state. He would not share the final compound. So I came to retrieve what was owed. You think me a thief? No. I am reclaiming life from ignorance. Watson saw Holmes's hand close subtly around the edge of the table, steadying himself for the storm he knew would follow. "And you reclaimed it," Holmes said, "with a draught from the same vial you gave him. Only his heart was weaker than yours." Bardi's hand trembled, and a drop of sweat traced his temple. "You cannot prove that." Holmes's smile was almost kind. "Cannot I? You left traces enough for a child to follow. The ladder at the library window, the lira by his desk, the scent of myrrh and ether, the very essence you used to embalm your so-called miracle. And now you compound your folly by returning for the evidence." The Italian's gaze darted toward the shattered glass, then to the corridor beyond. "You cannot detain me," he said sharply. "The law cannot grasp what it does not understand." He moved suddenly. The rose clutched close to his chest. Holmes lunged. There was a brief struggle, the sound of splintering wood, and a cry as the rose fell from Bardi's hand to the floor. It struck the hearth, scattering its crimson petals like blood upon the marble. Watson caught the intruder's arm while Holmes disarmed him of the small dagger that had flashed from his sleeve. "Your science, sir," Holmes said coldly, "has turned to ashes as swiftly as your flower." For a moment, Bardi seemed to sag, the arrogance gone. "You cannot stop it," he muttered. "The secret is not lost. It is in his notes, those you have not yet found." Holmes's eyes flicked toward him, sharp as the edge of a scalpel. "Then I shall find them before the dawn." The tramp of feet sounded in the passage. Rook appeared, lantern raised, followed by 2 policemen, summoned earlier by Holmes's foresight. "Inspector Lestrade's compliments, sir," Rook said. "He waits below." Holmes nodded. "Take Dr. Bardi to him. Inform the inspector that the matter concerns the unlawful possession of dangerous substances and the suspected poisoning of Lord Ashbury." Bardi's composure cracked. "You will regret this, Holmes. The dead will not rest." "The dead," Holmes said softly, "never do, especially when kept alive by men who fear to let them go." When the footsteps and voices had faded, the 2 companions stood alone amid the wreckage. The rose lay ruined upon the tiles, its spell broken at last. Holmes stooped, gathering a single petal between his fingers. It had already begun to brown at the edges. "So ends immortality," he said quietly. "In the end, Watson, even a counterfeit of life cannot escape decay." Watson regarded his friend with both awe and unease. And yet the experiment. What if his notes truly remain? Holmes replaced the petal under the glass dome. "Then they are the last clue in a game not yet finished. We have unmasked the hand that wielded the poison, but not the purpose that lies beneath it. Tomorrow we shall search the muniment room once more, for I have a suspicion, my dear Watson, that Lord Ashbury's final message was written, not in ink, but in the language of his roses." Morning light seeped pale and cold through the curtains of Ashbury House, brushing against the remnants of the night's disturbance. The shattered cloche had been cleared, the marble floor scrubbed clean of the rose's crimson dust, and Dr. Bardi now sat under guard in the study below, silent as a statue, his face drawn but defiant. Holmes stood at the window of the same room where the tragedy had begun, gazing into the fog-thick gardens where frost still clung to the sleeping soil. Watson entered quietly, coffee cup in hand, his eyes heavy from the night's vigil. "Lestrade has taken Bardi's formal statement," Watson reported. "He admits to having entered by the secret passage, but insists he came only to reclaim his property, not to harm Lord Ashbury. He swears your suspicions of poison are unfounded." Holmes turned slightly, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. A confession framed in half-truths, Watson, is merely a riddle with fewer syllables. Bardi lies because he must. He cannot afford the truth, not when the truth would damn him by its own reason. Watson sank into a chair. And yet, the evidence of direct murder is still circumstantial. You've proved that he concocted the compound that kept the rose alive, but not that it killed Lord Ashbury. Holmes nodded absently, pacing toward the desk. True. But death, my dear fellow, does not always proceed by the obvious route. Consider. Ashbury dies suddenly in the midst of his work. Bardi flees, leaving behind his apparatus, his coin, his trail. He returns at night, not to destroy evidence, but to retrieve one thing only, the rose. Why that? Not the notes, not the vials, not the formula itself. The rose. He tapped the edge of the desk. Because it is proof of success, proof that life, or the semblance of it, could be preserved indefinitely. A claim too dangerous to fall into anyone else's hands. Watson frowned. You think he wished to continue the experiments elsewhere? Perhaps, Holmes said. Or perhaps he feared what the rose contained. Before Watson could question further, there was a soft knock. Lady Ashbury entered, pale but composed, the morning's light making her seem almost spectral. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice subdued, "I cannot find peace in this house until I know the whole truth. If my husband was deceived, I must know by whom, but if he was complicit, if his death was of his own doing, I beg you to tell me plainly." Holmes regarded her with an uncharacteristic gentleness. "You have more courage, madam, than many men I have known. I believe your husband pursued knowledge beyond the safe boundary of reason. Whether Bardi's hand guided his ruin or not, the flame that consumed him was lit by his own ambition. Still, I think he left a message, a warning, perhaps, or a clue. It is to be found in the muniment room." Her brow furrowed. "The locked chamber?" "The same," Holmes said. "You told me none of your keys would open it. Yet it yielded easily to me last night, though only from within. Someone had relocked it after leaving, and the same person who crept back through the passage. I believe your husband meant that door to remain sealed only until his death." Watson rose. "You mean to search it again?" "At once," Holmes said. "Lestrade will keep Bardi secured. Meanwhile, the true resolution of this affair lies waiting beyond that door." They ascended once more to the upper gallery, their footsteps echoing faintly in the quiet house. The muniment room's iron bands gleamed dully in the dim light. Holmes unlocked the door and entered. Dust motes drifted like tiny ghosts in the slanting morning beam. The strange, dry air of the chamber was undisturbed, yet Holmes's eyes moved with hawk-like precision from one corner to another. He approached a writing stand pushed near the far wall, its surface covered with old ledgers and parchment scrolls. Beneath them, a small bound volume lay half hidden. Its cover bore no title, only the faint embossing of a rose. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "it appears Lord Ashbury kept a diary." He turned the pages carefully. The early entries spoke of estate matters, rents, investments, and weather. But gradually the tone darkened, the handwriting becoming more angular, more fevered. Holmes read aloud. "The Italian has shown me wonders. The serum preserves the bloom without corruption. He calls it the breath of perpetual youth. I see no harm in proving it first upon flowers, later perhaps a bird." He turned another page. "The effect endures, but I perceive a faint odour that troubles the chest. Bardi dismisses it as harmless. I must test it upon myself in lesser dose. Aurelia suspects and must not know." Holmes's voice grew taut. "Here, listen. Last night I dreamed I could feel the pulse of the rose as if it lived. When I woke, my own heart faltered. I fear the essence consumes what it preserves." He closed the book. slowly. There, Watson, lies the crux. The formula extended the illusion of life only by drawing vitality from the living thing nearest it. In perfect irony, Ashbury's creation fed upon his own strength. Watson stared. Then it was suicide by ignorance. He poisoned himself unknowingly. In effect, yes, Holmes said. Though I suspect Bardi knew the risk. He may have withheld that final truth to hasten a result he coveted. But the real brilliance lies in the manner of the experiment. Ashbury believed he had conquered decay. In truth, he had merely transferred it. The rose did not wither because he did. Lady Ashbury pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. He died for a flower. For the idea behind it, Holmes corrected softly. Men have died for less. They left the room in silence. As they descended the stairs, Holmes paused at the landing, looking back toward the closed door. "There remains one thing more," he said. "Bardi spoke of notes yet unfound. If he believed the secret hidden still, then Ashbury must have concealed a second record, one Bardi could not decipher." Watson followed his gaze. Where would a man hide something he feared the living might find? Holmes's eyes glimmered. Precisely where the dead might guard it best. Without further word, he turned toward the corridor that led to the family crypt adjoining the small chapel at the rear of the estate. The morning air grew colder as they approached, and the ancient hinges groaned at Holmes's touch. Inside, rows of carved names lined the stone walls. In the center, upon a raised dais, stood the newest vault, its inscription still fresh. Edward Ashbury, 1857-1899. Holmes knelt before it, examining the carved rose motif upon the marble lid. His fingers traced the petals, pausing where the stone felt subtly hollow beneath. He pressed. A small panel shifted. Inside lay a roll of parchment sealed with crimson wax. Holmes drew it out, the seal marked with a single symbol, a blooming rose encircled by a serpent devouring its tail. He smiled faintly. Ah, the rose that will not wilt indeed. Watson looked from the parchment to his friend. Holmes, what have you found? Proof, Holmes said quietly. And a question greater than murder, whether man, in striving to master nature, merely teaches death another shape in which to wait. Holmes examined the parchment by the dim light filtering through the chapel's narrow window, his eyes glinting with that fierce gleam which always signaled that his mind was in full flight. The crimson seal cracked softly under his fingers, releasing a faint scent of wax and something else, rose oil unmistakably. He unrolled the document with delicate precision. The writing within was dense and slanted, the hand feverish yet elegant, running to the very edge of the vellum. A single phrase repeated at intervals like a refrain. The bloom is the vessel of the breath. Beneath the lines of chemical notation and diagrams lay an inscription that seemed more confession than formula. Holmes read it aloud in measured tones. To preserve life, one must first bind decay. Yet in binding it, I have merely exchanged its prison. The rose endures because I have given it what was mine. When its color fades, I shall fade with it. May she forgive me. The words hung in the cold air like a whisper from the grave. Lady Ashbury, who stood a few paces behind, gave a quiet sob. Then it was true, she said. He knew what he was doing. He knew it would take him. Holmes folded the parchment gently. He knew only part of it, he replied. Such men never see the full pattern until it closes around them. The intellect soars, and the body pays the toll. He rose, brushing dust from his knees. Come, Watson, there remains something I must test. before we consign this to the yard's custody." They left the chapel, the echo of their steps fading through the corridor. Back in the morning room, the table stood bare, save for the ruined fragments of the rose and the empty cloche. Holmes placed the parchment beside the fragments and regarded them both in silence. The fire crackled low, throwing restless light across his face. "Observe," he said at last, "even now the petals darken more rapidly than nature allows. Whatever process preserved them has reversed. Decay hastens to reclaim what was stolen." Watson bent closer. "Then the effect is temporary?" "Not precisely," Holmes answered. "The balance has shifted. The rose's endurance was borrowed vitality, sustained by the life it drew from its creator. With Ashbury's death, the current ceased. The flower now collapses as he did." Lady Ashbury's eyes widened in dawning comprehension. "And that is why it never wilted while he lived?" "Exactly," Holmes said softly. "The perfect metaphor. One man's life feeding another's illusion. He bound his existence to the experiment, and when he died, the bond was broken. Dr. Barty's presence here was not to steal the formula, but to recover the last proof that it had worked." Watson looked troubled. "If this is true, Holmes, then Barty's crime lies not in murder, but in deceit. He let the man perish by his own hand." "A subtle distinction," Holmes said, "but one that the law will weigh heavily. Still there is more. The parchment's phrase, 'and the bloom is the vessel of the breath,' may be literal. I believe Lord Ashbury found a means to store organic vitality, a form of suspended respiration. The vapour beneath that cloche was not merely preservative, it was the transference of a living element." Watson shook his head. "You make it sound almost supernatural." Holmes's smile was faint, sardonic. "There is nothing supernatural in chemistry, my dear fellow, only effects whose causes we have yet to name. But consider the implication. If a man could delay decay by transferring vitality from one organism to another, he would have found the philosopher's stone of physiology. That is what tempted Barty. That is what killed Ashbury." A knock came at the door. Inspector Lestrade entered, removing his hat with a brisk nod. "Morning, gentlemen. The Italian's been moved to the yard. We've charged him with unlawful entry and suspicion of manslaughter pending the coroner's report. He's a cool one, though. Claims you'll never prove intent." Holmes gestured to the parchment. "Perhaps this will suffice. See that it is secured at once. But, mark me, Lestrade, there are truths here best kept from the sensational press. Let the matter stand as a scientific accident. The world is not yet ready for Lord Ashbury's kind of miracle." Lestrade took the document gingerly. "Very good, Mr. Holmes. I'll keep it close." "Anything else you'd have us do?" "Yes," Holmes said. "Have the laboratory sealed and remove all remaining vials and residues to Scotland Yard for analysis. No one must tamper with them. I'll send you my notes this evening." When the inspector had gone, Holmes returned to the hearth, where he stood gazing into the flames. Watson watched him, sensing that his friend's thoughts were far from the room. "You're not satisfied," he said quietly. Holmes's expression was unreadable. "Satisfied, yes. Consoled, no. The facts align, but their harmony is disquieting. I have seen murderers moved by greed, jealousy, revenge, but here we encounter a subtler demon, the pursuit of perfection. It devours reason as surely as any vice. Lord Ashbury's sin was not ambition alone. It was the arrogance of thinking nature might yield her laws to sentiment." Lady Ashbury approached slowly. "What will become of his name, Mr. Holmes?" "History will remember him as a nobleman struck down by illness," Holmes said. "That will suffice. His secret is better left buried with him." She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. "Then I thank you for restoring what peace you could." When she had gone, the house seemed to breathe again, as though some oppressive weight had lifted. Holmes turned to Watson, his tone lower, contemplative. "There is a melancholy justice in it, is there not? The rose that would not wilt dies only when its master's heart stops beating. Yet in that moment it becomes mortal again, beautiful in its failure." Watson studied him curiously. "You speak as if the case touched you more deeply than most." Holmes's gaze lingered on the fading petals. "It does, Watson. It reminds me that intellect, when unmoored from compassion, leads to ruin. Ashbury sought to imprison life itself, and in so doing, he invited death to share his table. I fear that lesson will be learned again, and often." A draught stirred the ashes in the hearth. The last of the rose's petals fluttered down, curling to black cinders in the fire. Holmes drew his coat about him and reached for his hat. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "The case is closed, and the morning grows late. London waits, and there are other enigmas in its fog." As they stepped into the mist-chilled air outside Ashbury House, Watson glanced back once. The windows glimmered faintly through the haze, like eyes that had seen too much. Holmes walked ahead with his usual brisk stride, but there was an unusual stillness in his bearing, as though even he, the great reasoner, had glimpsed the fragile thread that binds life, death, and the mystery between. The hansom rattled through the pale morning fog, its wheels splashing the thin drizzle that had begun to fall over Baker Street. Holmes sat in silence, his chin resting upon his clasped fingers, his eyes half closed in the abstraction that Watson had come to recognize as thought in its purest form. The grey light seemed to accentuate the sharp lines of his face, and though the case appeared concluded, Watson could sense in him that peculiar restlessness which follows when an intellect like his glimpses some detail still unresolved. When they reached 221B, Mrs. Hudson had prepared their breakfast and greeted them with her usual maternal relief at Holmes's safe return. But Holmes barely acknowledged her as he went straight to the fireplace, stirred the coals into flame, and drew from his pocket the single remaining petal he had taken from Ashbury's rose. He placed it gently upon a porcelain dish and leaned back in his chair. "You observed, Watson," he said at length, "that I kept this fragment. The temptation was not sentimental. I am not yet convinced that we have seen the last of Dr. Bardy's artifice." Watson raised an eyebrow. "You mean you suspect there was more to the process than chemical preservation?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely. The formula in Ashbury's notes described the mixture as volatile under heat and reactive to organic matter. That, in itself, was curious. For a compound intended to preserve, it responded as though it sought life rather than avoided its decay. I mean to test whether this rose, or what remains of it, still holds any trace of that vitality." He struck a match, lit a spirit lamp, and held the dish above the small flame. The petal curled almost instantly, but instead of blackening, it released a thin wisp of smoke that shimmered faintly blue. A strange, delicate fragrance filled the room. A scent neither floral nor chemical, something between incense and ozone. Watson felt a faint dizziness as it reached him. "Good heavens, Holmes," he murmured, stepping back. "What is that vapour?" Holmes leaned forward, inhaling carefully, but not deeply. "It is not poisonous," he said, his tone calm. "But it is remarkable. There is an ionization to it, Watson, a charge of energy one might associate with certain experiments in electricity or magnetism. Lord Ashbury may have stumbled upon an early form of organic catalysis, something that interacts with the life current itself. Watson frowned, still uneasy. You speak as if life were a substance that could be stored in a jar. Holmes's eyes glimmered in the firelight. And yet is that notion any stranger than the transference of heat or of light? Bardi's brilliance lay in giving material form to the immaterial. But you are correct, my friend. Life cannot be hoarded. It can only be borrowed, and the debt must always be repaid. The petal had by now turned to a fine white ash, glimmering faintly upon the dish. Holmes covered it with a glass slide and labelled it in his precise hand, Ashbury Compound, Final Residue. Then quite suddenly he rose and paced to the window. There is a pattern here that extends beyond the walls of Ashbury House. Bardi was no common charlatan. He is a man of science with means, working under foreign sponsorship. Such men rarely act alone. Watson followed his gaze. You think there are others involved? I know it, Holmes said simply. Observe Bardi's urgency, his determination to reclaim the rose even at the risk of arrest. His words, "The secret is not lost," were not the boast of a cornered man. They were the assurance of one whose work continues elsewhere. Watson's heart sank slightly. You fear there may be another experiment underway? Or worse, Holmes replied, that the principle has already been perfected. The idea of life suspended and revived at will is one to make both physician and philosopher tremble. If such knowledge fell into unscrupulous hands, it would open the door to horrors we can scarcely imagine. We must trace its origin before it disappears into the shadows of Europe. He crossed the room, took up his violin, and drew the bow lightly across the strings. The soft note quivered through the air, as if to steady his thoughts. Watson, you will accompany me to the yard. I have no faith in bureaucracy to guard what it cannot comprehend. We must examine Bardi's possessions before Lestrade seals them away in red tape. By noon, they stood once more within Scotland Yard's dreary offices. Lestrade, looking somewhat fatigued but brisk, ushered them into a small evidence room. Upon the table lay a collection of items seized from Bardi's person and lodgings. Several notebooks, a tin case of vials, a roll of copper wire, and a curious metallic tube fitted with a glass chamber at its centre. Holmes picked up the tube, turning it over in his hands. An electrostatic pump, he murmured. A miniature version of a device used in continental laboratories. Bardi's work indeed crosses borders. He examined the inside of the glass chamber, where faint streaks of residue clung to the surface. He experimented not merely with chemical preservation, but with electrical infusion. Ashbury's discovery was but the English chapter of a larger design. Lestrade frowned. Then you're saying this was organized, funded even? Undoubtedly, Holmes replied. There is a network here, a society perhaps dedicated to the pursuit of immortality under the guise of science. It would not surprise me to find their traces in Paris or Vienna, where such heresies are fashionable. Watson leaned forward. And Bardi? Holmes smiled thinly. Bardi will talk eventually, but before he does, I intend to decipher his shorthand. This notebook, see, written in Italian, yet interspersed with symbols used by the German alchemists of the 17th century. A cipher within a cipher. He tucked the notebook into his coat. We shall translate it at Baker Street. I suspect it will tell us more than any confession. Lestrade grunted. You know, Holmes, one day your curiosity will get you into trouble. It already has, Holmes said lightly. But curiosity, Inspector, is the only thing that keeps the mind from decay, much like Bardi's rose. They left the yard as the clouds began to part, revealing a weak wash of sunlight across the Thames. The city, with all its bustle and noise, seemed almost to mock the silent mystery that trailed them. As they climbed into a waiting cab, Watson cast a glance at his companion. "Holmes," he said quietly, "do you truly believe men will ever conquer death?" Holmes's face remained turned toward the light, unreadable. "Conquer it," he said. "No, Watson, but they may yet learn to mimic it. And imitation, as you well know, is often the first step toward ruin." The cab rattled away toward Baker Street, the sound of its wheels fading into the clatter of the city, while somewhere, far beyond the river, a man in a foreign laboratory bent once more over a single red rose that would not die. The fog had deepened again by the time Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street. Evening pressed close against the windows, turning the gaslight within to a soft amber glow. Holmes had already cleared the table, spreading Bardi's notebook open beside the metallic tube they had brought from the yard. His chemical flasks simmered quietly, exhaling faint tendrils of steam that mingled with the smell of tobacco. He was bent over the pages with his lens when Watson entered, removing his gloves. "Holmes," Watson said, "you've scarcely spoken since we left Scotland Yard. What have you discovered in those infernal symbols?" Holmes looked up, his face alight with the fervour of pursuit. "A discovery, my dear Watson, not of what is written, but of what is not written. Observe these margins." He tapped a page where rows of alchemical signs interwove with Italian script. They appear meaningless until one notes that the spacing of the symbols corresponds precisely with a cipher used by the Rosicrucian sect of the last century. When translated, the text refers to something called Il Circolo dell'Alba Immortale, the Circle of the Undying Dawn. A most theatrical name, but such cabals often choose poetry to mask their purpose. Watson frowned. "A society, then? You were right about an organization behind Bardi." Holmes nodded, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Indeed, and this society seems to have branches in Florence, Vienna, and even London. Here, listen." He read aloud from the decoded passage. "Well, the English benefactor has provided resources for continuation. Shipment to arrive through Dover under seal. The specimen preserved in codename Vita Rosa." He lowered the lens. "There can be little doubt, Watson. Bardi was but one agent of a broader enterprise, and Ashbury their unwitting financier." Watson stared at him. "Then the rose was never simply his obsession, it was the property of this circle?" "Precisely," Holmes said, pacing the room with quick, restless strides. "And when Ashbury hesitated, fearing the moral cost of his work, they silenced him, whether by deceit or by calculated neglect. It scarcely matters. What matters is that the formula, or at least part of it, survived. This tube," he lifted the instrument from the table, "is not merely a pump. It is a vessel designed to hold and transport the living compound itself. Note the insulation along the sides, the sealed glass core, and the thin copper filament. It could sustain an electrical charge sufficient to animate suspended cells. Ingenious, Watson, but abominable." Watson drew closer, examining the device with both awe and unease. "Then it truly was the imitation of life." Holmes smiled faintly, though his eyes were distant. "An imitation which, if perfected, could blur the boundary between death and existence. Imagine such knowledge in the hands of those who trade in power, a soldier who never tires, a ruler who never dies. What tyranny could be more absolute?" Watson shuddered. "And yet this circle may already be working toward it." Holmes turned abruptly, his movements precise, purposeful. "That is why we must act, according to this entry. Another shipment, presumably the remaining materials, was due to arrive in London tomorrow by the night mail from Dover. The consignment is addressed under the name Marchese di Rovigno. A title, no doubt, but no such person is recorded in the Italian peerage. Bardi intended to collect it before his arrest. We shall do so in his stead. Watson looked alarmed. Holmes, you mean to intercept it yourself? Unless you propose to entrust it to Lestrade, Holmes replied with dry amusement. No, my dear fellow, this is a game for subtler hands. I have already dispatched a telegram to the customs house to detain the crate under suspicion of contraband. Tonight we shall visit the docks. If the Circle means to retrieve their property, they will not come empty-handed. By 9 o'clock they were en route to the river. The fog along the Thames hung low and heavy, the lamps of the embankment glowing like will-o'-the-wisps above the dark tide. Their cab stopped near the old warehouses by Wapping, where a solitary lamp burned outside the customs office. Holmes paid the driver and drew his collar close. "A pleasant evening for necromancers," he murmured. Inside, a harried clerk led them to a small storage room. "Yes, sir. Crate came from Calais on the evening ferry," he said, consulting his ledger. "Marked fragile, declared as botanical specimen. Signed for delivery to the Marchese di Rovigno, as you said. We've kept it here under seal." The crate stood in the corner, nondescript, save for the faint scent of chemicals that seeped from its joints. Holmes examined the label, then the nails securing the lid. "Curious," he muttered, "no sign of tampering. Yet the wood is still damp from the sea air. And this straw, fresh, not the packing from Dover. The crate has been opened and resealed within the past 24 hours. He pried the lid gently with his penknife. Inside, beneath layers of padding, lay a cylindrical canister wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes unrolled it carefully. "Another vessel," he said. "Larger than the first and more sophisticated." The faint hum of metal resonated as he touched it. "Watson, hold the lantern nearer." As Watson obeyed, a shadow moved across the frosted glass of the warehouse window. Brief, then gone. Holmes froze, his expression tightening. "We are not alone," he whispered. He replaced the canister and lowered the lid. "Quickly, Watson, behind the crates." The door opened without a sound. 2 figures entered, tall, cloaked, faces obscured by scarves against the fog. One held a lantern shaded low, the other a small pistol. They spoke in hushed Italian. Holmes translated under his breath. "They mean to take it tonight. The Circle has come to reclaim its treasure." The men approached the crate. As the first bent to lift it, Holmes stepped from the shadows, revolver in hand. "1,000 pardons, gentlemen," he said coolly, "but I fear your consignment is already under investigation." The taller of the two cursed and fired. The shot splintered a beam above Holmes's head. Watson returned fire instinctively, striking the lantern from the man's hand. Darkness swallowed the room save for the dim flame of a fallen lamp. The intruders fled toward the river door, their footsteps echoing. Holmes dashed after them, Watson close behind. Out on the quay the fog had thickened to a pale wall. They caught sight of one figure leaping onto a waiting boat where a small engine sputtered to life. Holmes fired once, shattering the tiller. The craft drifted, spinning helplessly as the remaining man disappeared into the mist. Holmes lowered his weapon. "They were prepared," he said grimly. "But they have lost both their prize and their nerve. The Circle will not abandon the chase, Watson, and now they know that Sherlock Holmes stands between them and their dream of immortality." He turned toward the glowing city skyline, his breath visible in the cold air. "The game, my dear Watson," he said softly, "has only just begun." The fog clung to the river long after dawn, muffling the cries of the dock workers and softening the splash of oars as the damaged boat drifted helplessly against the quay. Holmes stood at its edge, the sharp morning wind stirring his coat, his eyes fixed on the oily water where the reflection of the sun trembled like liquid fire. Watson joined him, the canister from the crate safely locked in the customs officer's hands behind them. For a time, neither spoke. The events of the night still lingered in the air like the scent of smoke after gunpowder. "It was close work, Holmes," Watson said finally. "Had that bullet been an inch lower—" Holmes smiled faintly, though his gaze did not shift from the water. "An inch, my dear Watson, is the usual distance between tragedy and triumph. Yet we stand and the circle does not. That must suffice for the morning." Watson followed his eyes. "You think the two men we saw were mere agents, not principals?" "Undoubtedly. The one who escaped moved with the precision of discipline, but not the confidence of command. A subordinate, perhaps a courier. No leader of men flees into fog without his prize." He turned suddenly, his mind once again alight. "Still the question remains, who is the Marchese di Rovigno? The circle's phantom name must conceal a real patron, and I fancy he will not bear investigation kindly." They returned to Baker Street before noon, bringing the sealed canister with them. Holmes placed it carefully upon the table beside Bardi's smaller instrument. "Two vessels," he murmured, "built to preserve the same essence, yet one crude and one refined. The progression of design implies funding, Watson, money and method applied over years. Such improvements are not born of chance." Watson had barely seated himself when a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, a telegram in hand. Holmes tore it open and read aloud. Information requested received. "Marchese di Rovigno, known alias of Count Alphys Veraldi, Venetian expatriate, presently resident in Paris. Former professor of physiology dismissed from university under charges of grave misconduct. Connection to occult research suspected." Mycroft. Holmes's brows lifted. "Ah, my brother moves swiftly. Count Veraldi. Yes, I recall his name. He lectured once at the Royal Society on cellular regeneration. A mind of immense promise, yet unstable. When challenged upon his ethics, he proclaimed that science must serve eternity, not morality." Watson exhaled softly. A dangerous creed. "Precisely why the circle would follow him," Holmes said. "He is their philosopher and their priest. If he resides in Paris, that is where the true formula will be safeguarded. The circle may have lost their English agent, but they will not surrender the secret that defines their faith." He moved to the window, the telegram crumpled in his fingers. "We must anticipate their next move. Bardi's arrest will reach Veraldi by telegram before the week is out. He will suspect interference and attempt to recover the canister through diplomatic channels, if not by stealth." Watson leaned forward. "Then you intend to confront him?" "Confront him, yes, but on English soil if possible. He will not expect pursuit beyond the Channel so soon." Holmes turned, his eyes alight with that curious blend of cold logic and excitement that came to him in moments of peril. "Watson, there is a train to Dover within the hour. Bring your revolver and a stout heart. Both may be required before nightfall." Their journey was swift, the train clattering through the damp countryside beneath a ceiling of low clouds. Holmes spent the entire passage in concentrated silence, his long fingers drumming lightly upon his knee, his eyes distant. When at last they reached Dover, he sought out the harbour-master and produced his credentials. "A Venetian nobleman, travelling under the name of Count Veraldi," he said. "Has such a passenger arrived within the last fortnight?" The official consulted his ledger. "Arrived 3 days ago, sir, aboard the Étoile du Nord. Gave instructions to reserve passage again for tonight, returning to Calais." Holmes's face darkened. "Then he means to flee. We have but hours." By twilight, they were stationed at the dockside hotel, overlooking the pier where the night ferry awaited departure. Holmes sat near the window, his pipe unlit, eyes fixed upon the gangway as shadows deepened across the harbour. "He will come for the canister himself," he said quietly. "He will not risk another intermediary. A mind such as his trusts only its own cunning." At 8:30, a carriage drew up before the quay. A tall, gaunt man in a dark overcoat stepped out, his silver hair gleaming beneath the lamplight. Even at a distance, the authority of his bearing was unmistakable. He carried no luggage save a slim leather case. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "There walks the Count, and the case, I would wager, holds the missing component of Bardi's experiment." They followed discreetly as Veraldi crossed the pier toward the customs shed. But before he reached it, another figure detached itself from the fog, Lestrade emerging at Holmes's prior signal with 2 constables. The Count halted, one hand slipping toward his coat. "Count Alves Veraldi," Holmes called, stepping forward. "In the name of the Crown, I request that you surrender the case in your possession." Veraldi's eyes glinted with cold amusement. "You presume much, Mr. Holmes. I am a guest of your government." "A guest who traffics in death under the guise of progress," Holmes replied. "Your associate Bardi has confessed enough to damn you both." For a moment, the Count seemed to consider resistance, but then he smiled, a smile that chilled more than defiance would have done. "You are too late, Mr. Holmes. The circle does not depend upon one man's hands. The seed has already been sown elsewhere." He tossed the case suddenly into the air. Holmes sprang forward, catching it just as the Count wrenched free of the constables and dashed toward the ferry. A shout rose. Lestrade gave chase, but Veraldi leapt the railing, vanishing into the mist below. The splash that followed was swallowed by the roar of the sea. Holmes stood motionless, the leather case held tightly against his chest. "He's gone," he said softly. "Whether by choice or fate, I cannot tell, but his part in this tale is finished." They returned to London the next morning, the case unopened, until they reached Baker Street. Inside, cushioned in velvet, lay a single vial of faintly luminous liquid, clear as water yet pulsing with a soft internal light. Holmes regarded it long and silently before locking it in his cabinet. "Watson," he said at last, "there are discoveries best left unrealized. The Circle sought to master life, but they have only taught us how fragile it is. Let this be their epitaph." Watson nodded gravely. "And the vial?" "It will remain here," Holmes said, turning away. "Sealed, untested, and unspoken of again. For if the rose taught us anything, it is that life, prolonged without purpose, is but another form of decay." The fire crackled softly in the hearth as Holmes resumed his chair, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's tolled the hour, and the fog began to lift from the city, thin, uncertain, like a dream dissolving with the dawn. The days that followed passed in an unusual quiet at Baker Street. The newspapers carried only the barest mention of the foreign intrigue at Dover, the details discreetly suppressed under governmental advisement. Dr. Bardi had been extradited to Italy under heavy guard, where he would face trial for his experiments. The mysterious circle of the undying dawn had for the moment faded back into the shadows from which it came, yet Holmes's mind was far from rest. For 2 evenings he sat by the fire, the sealed vial locked within the drawer of his desk, untouched but never far from his gaze. Its faint inner light, visible even through the keyhole, seemed at times to flicker as though it breathed. On the 3rd evening, as a cold rain swept across the city, Watson found him thus, his violin silent upon his knee, his expression that of a man in contemplation rather than victory. "You have not destroyed it?" Watson said quietly. "The vial, it still exists." Holmes's eyes met his, sharp yet thoughtful. "Destroyed? No, I have considered it, but destruction is as dangerous as discovery when one does not fully comprehend the nature of what one holds. The substance within that glass may be inert, or it may be alive. To shatter it might be to release something we could neither name nor recall." Watson frowned. "Then it will remain locked away forever." "Forever, if we are fortunate," Holmes replied. "I have arranged with Mycroft that it be placed in the custody of certain scientific authorities who understand discretion. It will be sealed under the Official Secrets Act, its existence recorded only in the briefest terms. The Circle will not regain it." Watson exhaled, relief mingling with curiosity. "You believe their threat ended?" Holmes rose, walking to the window where the rain traced pale lines down the glass. "Ended? No, merely postponed. Knowledge once conceived is not so easily buried. Somewhere, perhaps in some laboratory across the Channel, another mind untroubled by conscience will attempt to revive the dream. That is the peril of intellect untempered by wisdom, Watson. The pursuit of life everlasting breeds only the promise of endless ruin." He turned then, a glint of rueful amusement touching his lips. "You may set it down if you wish, The Case of the Rose That Would Not Wilt. A pretty title for a cautionary tale. But omit, I beg you, the more perilous truths. The world already holds too many temptations for the curious." Watson smiled faintly. "You fear the world's curiosity more than its ignorance?" "Always," Holmes said. "Ignorance may kill, but curiosity corrupts. It leads men to replace reverence with vanity, faith with formula, and life with its imitation. Ashbury and Bardi were not villains in the common sense. They were explorers who mistook the abyss for the horizon. Their failure lies in the same arrogance that builds cathedrals to reason without asking who will dwell within." He returned to the hearth, where the fire burned low, and added another coal with slow deliberation. "Do you recall, Watson, what I said that first evening when Lady Ashbury's messenger arrived? That a rose which would not wilt was as unnatural as a clock that would not run down. Both promise eternity, but both must be wound by a human hand. The tragedy is that man so often winds his own destruction." Watson regarded him, deeply moved. "And yet you pit reason against such follies every day." Holmes's smile softened, touched with something rare, a quiet humility. "Ah, but I am no saviour, my dear fellow, merely a physician of disorder, prescribing logic where others administer superstition. I mend what I can until the next madness arises." The clock on the mantel chimed 8. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the city washed and still. Holmes took up his violin and after a moment's pause drew from it a melody unlike his usual restless improvisations, a low, reflective air full of strange beauty and restrained sorrow. The notes filled the room, mingling with the faint hiss of the fire. When the music ceased, he set the bow aside and leaned back, his expression unreadable. "It is done, then," he murmured. "The rose has wilted at last." Watson rose to leave, pausing at the door. "And what of Lady Ashbury?" he asked softly. "How did she bear the truth?" Holmes's eyes lingered on the flames. "With grace, Watson. More than most would. She chose to plant a single white rose upon her husband's grave. It blooms only once a year, but that is enough. She understands now what Ashbury never did. That beauty lies not in the defiance of decay, but in its acceptance." Watson nodded slowly. "And you, Holmes, what will you do?" A faint, knowing smile touched Holmes's lips as he reached for his pipe. "What I always do, my dear doctor, await the next impossible problem to restore my peace of mind." As Watson stepped into the night, the gaslights of Baker Street burned faintly through the mist. Somewhere behind him, he heard the first strains of Holmes's violin, rising once more, no longer mournful, but contemplative, as though the great detective had found a certain calm in the acceptance of unsolved mysteries, and thus the case of the rose that would not wilt passed quietly into legend, its bloom faded, its secret sealed, and its warning lingering like a faint perfume in the air of Baker Street, where intellect forever danced with danger, and the thin razor edge between knowledge and wisdom gleamed like a blade beneath the London fog.